Hello, my name is Julie Alexander, and I'm an administrator and professor at the University of Phoenix, and I also am the founder of Alexander and Intersectional Presentations. Today I'm going to talk to you about LGBTQIA plus vocabulary and kind of just an overview of the vocabulary and kind of giving you an understanding of what gender spectrum and sexuality spectrums are and how those connect with the LGBTQIA plus community. So if we were meeting in a virtual space or face-to-face, I would ask you to share your pronouns, tell us where you are, where you're working, and then your mashup of your favorite color and animal. But since this is a recording, you can just share that with yourself and we'll move on. Also, when we do recordings and when we're sharing, I really like to make sure that we have some group norms. And even though this is a recording and we're not doing this in a group setting, I still want to talk about some of these because sometimes these group norms are important to take into other situations, especially when you're talking about marginalized populations. So always make sure that we're doing respect. Sometimes we do need to take risks and ask things and create understanding that we don't always have. But one of the big ones too that a lot of people I think should think about within a work setting is openness, but also oopses and ouches. So sometimes we have sayings in society that are seen as acceptable, but really can be hurtful to some people. So like one of them is, it's so gay, or that's so gay, right? A lot of people say that, a lot of people think that that's okay, but really that is is insulting to people who are within the LGBTQI community. So if someone says that, someone might say, ouch, that hurt, and help educate that person about why that might hurt. Sometimes too, within the mental health field, some people say, oh, I had such a schizophrenic day. And it's like, well, wait a second. First of all, a lot of people use it as in an incorrect way. More talking about associative identity disorders and that they felt like different people throughout the day instead of schizophrenia, where you have hallucinations, verbal, auditory, and visual. But also, how do you know what it's like to have a mental illness? And so it's kind of downgrading it when you say you have it. Sometimes we need to give people a space to pass and to let them sit with things and to understand them in their own way and not always have to participate right away. Really listen. So we are really good at listening while we're trying to figure out what we're going to say next instead of really listening to what the person's saying. So take the time to really listen to what other people are saying, and especially if there's a misunderstanding or something that you don't understand or a miscommunication. A lot of times I found when I worked with groups that sometimes a misunderstanding can come over two people using the same word in very different ways, but not realizing that. Like respect, right? What does that mean? It can mean something very different to one person than it can mean to another, but they both think that the other person is the same definition. So sometimes checking in with definitions is good. And then you always want to make sure that people feel safe, that confidentiality is held when it should be, and that people feel safe to ask questions and to help educate themselves. And those are all important. So let's get started. So hopefully along with this video, there's also a packet of a handout. And in fact, there's a link at the bottom of this slide, but hopefully there's one with where the recording is posted. And so what I'd like you to do is to take a moment first and to look at these vocabulary sheets. And when you're looking at them, you kind of say, do I know this word well or don't I know this word well? Do I know it somewhat? Do I have no clue? And then what terms or association, or what do you associate with those terms? And so even if you don't know a definition, you might have some association with that word, even though you might not know the definition. And this is kind of seeing where you are, but also taking the second to really reflect on that. And sometimes too, even us who are involved with the field and know the vocabulary and feel that we have a good understanding, some vocabulary within the LGBTQIA plus community changes. Because a lot of times we have young people who are coming in and using the words in different ways than we've used before. It's a very youth-led vocabulary in that way. And sometimes reclaiming words that we hadn't used before, like queer and dyke and those kinds of things. So take a second. I'm not going to totally stop the video, but you should stop the video and take as much time as you need to really look over the two different vocabularies. One is more focused on gender. One side of the sheet is more focused on gender, and the other side of the sheet is more focused on sexuality. So feel free to pause the video as long as you need before. And then when you're ready, click it back on and we'll go and start talking about vocabulary. So the biggest misunderstanding that we have found within the LGBTQIA community is that understanding that gender and sexuality are two completely different things. The way that I identify as my gender has nothing to do with my sexuality. The way that I dress for my gender has nothing to do with my sexuality, who I'm attracted to. And the reality is we all have gender and we all have sexuality. So our gender may be a gender, that we're not picking a specific gender, but we still identify as that type of gender, a gender. Whereas sexuality, we have lesbian, gay, all of those. So if you look at this umbrella, the ones that are in bold are the ones that are usually considered within the LGBTQIA community. So under gender, that's transgender, questioning gender, genderqueer, intersex, and agender, and the plus, because we have changes a lot happening within the LGBTQIA community, as I said before, but we also, it's hard to sometimes identify everyone. So people will identify their gender, and it is their choice to identify how their gender is. For someone else to assign somebody else's gender is not appropriate. And then, of course, within the larger community, we have male, female, and cisgender. And cisgender means when my body parts match the gender that I associate with. So I'm a woman who is identified as female at birth, and I identify as female now. That would be considered cisgender. And then on the other side of the umbrella, with the umbrella stick in between because they don't influence each other, is sexuality. So sexuality is lesbian, gay, bisexual, meaning that I'm attracted to both men and women, which is a little bit different than pansexual, which means I am sexually attracted to lots of different people, or romantically attracted to lots of different people, and gender doesn't play into part of that at all. Questioning sexuality, queer, plus, and then asexual. So we all start as asexual beings. We don't really have sexual desires or sexual attraction until we start to go through puberty. And sometimes some people never have sexual attraction, and that's just the way that it kind of is. And so we have this continuum. And so this is the human umbrella, in that we all belong, we all fit under the human umbrella, we all have gender, we all have sexuality. And being a female who identifies as a lesbian, it does not mean that I never wear dresses, because I wear dresses all the time, right? My sexuality of being a lesbian should not influence my identity as female, and my identity also as a feminine female, that I like dresses, I like to put my hair up, I like those kinds of things. Whereas some other lesbians are not as feminine, but still identify as female. And so there's also this whole range within all of those. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So let's talk about how these different pieces fit in together, and that each of these different pieces are really on a spectrum. So here at the Gender Bear, our gender identity is how we associate mentally. So we know now through research that genitalia and our identification of gender brain-wise are developed at two different times in utero. So it is understandable that those two things may be very different, right? And so our gender, our sex is down here, right? Our genitalia. And then our gender identity is up here, who we identify with, who we associate with. And both of them are on a spectrum. There isn't just female here and then male here and nothing in the middle. There's a lot in the middle. And so we need to realize that, and not just, oh, we think that it should be. We have shown medically that it really is, that that when we talk about sex and hormones, we find out that there are women who are have female genitalia and have a high testosterone level that's higher than some men, and we find men that are have male genitalia and have a high estrogen level that is higher than some women who have female genitalia. So there really is a spectrum. There isn't one dividing line that says from here over is male and from here over is female. It really is a spectrum, even for our genitalia, because we also have intersex, where intersex is where people are born sometimes with both genitalia appearing, or someone can be intersex and maybe not even know it for most of their life until maybe they have a CAT scan where they see that they present with a vagina at birth, but then find out that they have undescended testes in their lower left quadrant, which isn't totally unusual. That would be considered someone who's intersex. Or someone may present with a penis, but also have a uterus. Those would be intersex also. So those are normal occurring. It isn't something that went wrong. It's just the way that we're developed, because it's really the spectrum. So gender is how we feel, and sex is the identity that we're given, and gender expression is how I express my gender to you. And I may change my gender expression to you depending on how I express my gender to the world, depending on the circumstances. So like when I go out to dinner with my wife, I may be very feminine and wear a really nice dress, whereas when I'm at home on our farm, I'm probably not wearing as nice as feminine stuff, though I always wear dresses. So, but other people may do that very differently. And so our gender expression can also change from day to day. It can change from people that we're with, and it can change, so feminine, masculine, and then androgynous in the middle. So those three spectrums of gender, the gender identity, the sex, and which is our assigned genitalia, the genitalia that we have at birth, and then our gender expression all go together. So before we go on to sexual orientation and sexuality, let's just take a break for a second and let's do another activity. So let's do the gender spectrum activity. So this is to kind of give you an idea of how gender is a spectrum. So go ahead, this is the second worksheet, or the third worksheet, and here are some of them. So you're gonna identify whether you are your biological sex at birth, your gender identity now, your gender expression at a family gathering, on a date, or at a dance, your gender expression in the woods, camping, hiking, hunting, your gender expression when you cook, your gender expression when you're alone, your gender expression that's expected by society, and your gender expression right now. So go ahead and take a couple seconds and fill this out, and I'll stop talking for a couple seconds. So hopefully you see in filling out this activity is that there is some, even within yourself, that you may have some wiggle room, that your gender identity and your gender expression isn't always exactly the same. And that's okay, because that's that spectrum. That's the way that we are. And so it's really important that when you're thinking about your gender expression, your gender identity is to also realize that it's not always one or the other, that you're not always stuck one place in the spectrum, that sometimes there's flexibility in the spectrum depending on our age, depending also on our comfortability of if we feel safe to fully express our gender, those kinds of different things. Also, we also realize that a lot of times when people are like, well, this is so stereotypical, this is, so society influence. Yes, gender expression is societal influence, right? You go to different countries, you will see that gender expression and how you express your gender and what you're supposed to wear and how you wear it and what you do is different in different cultures, right? So in the United States culture, right, men don't wear skirts, they don't wear dresses. Well, in other cultures they do, and that's completely acceptable and not an issue, right? And so also holding hands, a lot of other cultures, men hold hands. They're friends, they're not gay, it's just part of society. But heaven forbid that happened in the United States, they're right away associated with being gay. Again, gender expression connected with sexuality, and it really isn't. And so realizing that piece, that there really is, and then also realizing that gender expression societally too gives a much wider ability for females to have a much wider definition of or the wider range of what we can do for femininity, right? We just go into a Kohl's and we see 3/4 of the store is female, and then you got the little male section over here. And not only that, as a female or someone who looks like a female, I can go into the male section and buy clothes and no one cares, or even wear those clothes. And that's not that big of a deal. But heaven forbid that someone who identifies as male or looks male goes into the female section, and then there's lots of questions. Oh, you must be buying it for someone else. You can't be buying it for yourself. And so those also are there. And we know that that negatively affects men. There's a study from Canada that was done in Vancouver. I'm sorry, it wasn't done in Vancouver. It was done in British Columbia, and it looked at gay straight alliances within high schools, and we found, or gender sexuality alliances in high schools, and we found that if there was one there for at least 3 years, the rate of suicide went down in all categories. So big thing, big difference. But the rate of suicide for heterosexual identifying males went down the most, showing that when we have a very tight definition of what maleness is, boys are more likely to commit suicide trying to fit into this little definition, instead of us allowing us to have these wider definitions of what's female and what's male. So yes, there is a connection between our gender expression and societal norms, and it should be there, and we should understand that those two things intersect. So let's go back to the gender bear, and let's talk about sexual orientation and sexuality. So sexual orientation, romantic, is also sometimes connected in this group, is who my heart beats for, who I feel really gooey and get excited about when I see them, when I talk to them, those kinds of things. And so we know that we have that you're sexually attracted to the opposite sex, sexually attracted to the same sex, or you can be both and in the middle, or gender doesn't matter at all, right? And so this also is a spectrum that is very kind of rare to find people that are only sexually attracted to the opposite sex, or only people who are sexually attracted to the same gender. There's a lot of in between and a lot of wiggle room in between. And it also, again, depends on safety. If youth are not feeling safe to explore their sexuality, a lot of times they are very good at suppressing it. Adults too, if it's not safe to really identify that. So realize too that also plays into the spectrum, that I might be here even though I really want to be here, because being here is safe, being here is not safe. Okay, so let's kind of do the same activity that we did with the gender spectrum with the sexuality spectrum. So here's your next worksheet. So see where you are on these 9 questions. So who have you kissed the most? Who have you been intimate with the most? Who are you involved presently? Your first intimate relationship? Fantasized? Desire to touch naked bodies? Looked for during a social event? Non-sexual petting or body closeness recently, and fantasized, and then who your family believes you're most attracted to. And all of these things play into our sexuality. So I'll give you a couple seconds to fill this one out also. And so you might also see that you may not always be exactly in the middle or exactly on one side for all of these things, that this changes. And again, too, what does it mean to be sexually attracted? And what does it mean to say, oh, that's a nicely developed body, right? And we sometimes overlap those things. So again, societal pressures and societal norms and expectations play into sexuality. And it also plays into it in that for some youth who are grown up in a more narrow-seeing society, that really heterosexuality is the only way to go, may not even know about other options, and may feel that their feelings are not good because they don't know anybody else or heard about anybody else who has those attractions to the same gender and those kinds of things, or to more than one gender. And so that's also a whole nother piece that plays into this. So now that we've kind of gone over these different these different genders and the spectrums and the gender bear and the human umbrella, let's go back to those pages and look at your vocabulary again. So here is the vocabulary for things. So take a second to look over both and see where you are now. Can you define all those words? Do you still have issues with some of those words? Go ahead and look at that. And also there's a second handout that also has a definition for all of these vocabulary words. So if you don't know them now, you can look them up. If we were doing this as a live session, this would be the time too that I would open it up and say, hey, do you have any questions? Here are all the gender vocabulary words that we're having. So some of the ones that some people have asked the most about is sometimes becoming authentic or transitioning it can be that with transgender, and realize too that even the whole concept of transgender has changed within the last 15 to 20 years. So 15 to 20 years ago, if someone said, I'm transgender, it meant that they had to officially transition, do all of the surgeries, do all of the hormones, do everything to officially become that gender. And a lot of times it was expected that you would be hyper that gender to really prove you wanted to be that gender. And so that was the expectation 15 to 20 years ago. Whereas now transgender is really a whole spectrum in itself, and that some people who identify as transgender identify as that and have their gender expression as that gender that they're transitioning to, but may not or may take hormones, that may or may not have the surgery, maybe just the top surgery and not the bottom surgery. So we're seeing a lot of that it's much more acceptable within the transgender that you don't have to go all the way and you don't have to be hyper female, right? So that's a huge change that's happened within the transgender world. And so that becoming authentic, meaning you're becoming your authentic identity, your authentic self. And passing and stealth also is sometimes asked about. So passing or stealth means that other people identify you as the gender that you want to be identified with. So a lot of times this goes again with transgender, that someone who transitions male to female. Passing would be that everybody just assumes that you're a cisgender female and not that you're a transgender female, those kinds of things. And so we see those at different times and different places. Sometimes people go stealth for safety reasons. Sometimes it's also a goal for some people. So it's a different piece within that. Gender dysphoria too is the one where individuals have issues with their gender, and a lot of times it's because their gender assigned at birth is not the gender that they identify with, and that is a very hard thing, that you have this daily reminder with your genitalia that you are not the gender that you identify with, and that there's this discord within your body. And that sometimes is really hard for people who are experiencing that, and especially for youth who can't transition all the way through until they're older. And hence why hormone blockers are really important, even if a youth comes out during puberty. To have blockers will not negatively affect them, but will give them time to start making that adjustment and realize what their true gender is before they figure out what the next step is. And then here are the words for sexuality, the vocabulary connected with sexuality. So romantic attraction is not as much that I want to physically get close with you and have do sexual acts together. Romantic attraction is I just want to be with you, and maybe kissing and a little bit of petting, but not the full sexual experience. Heteronormative is basically our society, that our society is kind of that everything, the expectation is that people are hetero, and so almost all things are hetero. Forms, like when I go to fill out forms and it asks, it doesn't say spouse one or spouse two, it says husband and wife, right? Those kinds of things. It says father and mother on a form for children. It doesn't say parent one, parent two, which kind of sounds weird, but indirectly it's a much nicer way to do that, and not the assumption that there is a hetero. Intersectionality also means that people who are in more than one oppressed group, those different identities coming together play differently. So for intersectionality, so I am a white woman who is a lesbian, and so a lot of times when I'm with my wife and out, a lot of people will kind of try and figure out how we're related. You know, are we friends? Are we sisters? Are we cousins? Those kinds of things. Whereas I have a friend who's lesbian and Black, and her partner is white. And so when they go out, the assumption is usually that she is the one there to watch the kids, not that the two of them have a relationship. So that's the intersectionality of being Black and being lesbian in this country as compared to being a lesbian and white in this country, and the privilege that gives me. I think we've talked about quite a lot of sexuality. Sexual fluidity means that sometimes people have a fluidness of their sexual, that they're not always staying in one place on that spectrum, that it can change. And for some people that, you know, they're very attracted to females, and then they're very attracted to males, and then they're very attracted to others. And just because someone changes who they're attracted to does not mean that they're not going to be good partners in relationships. So someone who's bisexual or pansexual or sexual fluidity, just because who they're attracted to changes, doesn't mean that they're going to keep changing partners. If they find a partner that they have a good connection with, then they definitely could have just as good a relationship with that person as anybody else who isn't bisexual. So those kinds of things. Of course, it's again, who's in the relationship and how that comes together and how they define it and all of those different things. And again, the people in the relationship define the relationship, not the people outside of the relationship. And sometimes too, when we start intersectionality too, of like gender and sexuality and like these labels. So, you know, there's a real question of, you know, if someone is male to female, transgender, male to female, may still have a penis and is in a relationship with a woman. Is that a heterosexual relationship because the person still has a penis? Or is it a lesbian relationship because they both identify as female? And so we start to go, this is where we need the pluses, because we don't have terms for everything. But again, it would not be our responsibility to say what their relationship is. It would be their responsibility to say, we're in a lesbian relationship, we're in a hetero relationship, or we're in a relationship and it doesn't really matter what you want to call it. We're not labeling it. And so realize that piece too, that sometimes allowing people not to have to follow societal norms gives them power and makes them feel like they have the power because they are defining their relationship instead of trying to fit it into these boxes that we created society. So that's the end of LGBTQIA plus vocabulary. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email is here at the bottom. I'm happy to, even after this presentation is posted. And if you're interested in any other trainings, feel free to reach out. Thank you so much and have a wonderful day.